And therefore, his passion for the Lord is so clear that he can actually then say with a clear conscience somehow, search me and know my heart. And I believe in many ways Dr. Morris was coming across as that way.
Okay, Dr. Clary or Dr. Ross, how did plants survive the flood?
You get that one first, because you kicked one over to me first.
I'll try. He's the paleontologist, so I'll start. Well, plants, there's a lot of pollen and seeds floating around, and I think a lot of those could have survived through the water, and settled down into the soil as the water went down. So they kind of have an advantage in that regard. They can spread all over the earth. I think there's a lot of plants and pollen that can survive, rough conditions, water conditions. And so the plants themselves, a lot of them are buried into coal deposits and these organic deposits that we see. But, and there are some that, many of them went extinct, just like some of the animals went extinct that were marine animals, went extinct, like the trilobites and things like that. So the environment and conditions change, but I think there was ways that God provided for the plants because of their seeds and their pollen and things. That's kind of my first thoughts. I'll turn it over to Dr. Ross.
Not a paleobotanist. But yeah, there's certainly some mechanisms. Some plants are not as salt tolerant as others, and that poses some difficulties for us in trying to understand how plants might have been able to recolonize or survive flood conditions. We do know that when plant communities are ripped and torn to shreds, such as what we saw in the Japanese tsunami in 2011, that there are often large debris rafts and piles that float out on the ocean for very long periods of time. And that might be a source of a reservoir for pollen and other types of germination materials. We also know that Noah was instructed to bring food on board the ark to take on the types of food plants that would be necessary. And he planted a vineyard afterwards, right? So he was probably bringing along certain types of seeds as well. And so there's certain types of plants that he was going to favor. One of the things I was mentioning on my walk back, my late walk back over here, sorry guys, was that the world that we live in now is a vastly different place than the world that was before the flood. And when we look at those plants that Dr. Clare was just mentioning that make up coal and things like that, they're not the sorts of plants that we have around today. They're very, very different. And it seems like the world that we live in is a post-disaster type of fauna and flora. The animals and the plants that came to dominate the world after the flood are very different from the ones that seem to have been successful in the pre-flood world. It's kind of like what happens after a major forest fire. You see a succession of different types of plants that take over, and that could also lead us to some of the questions as to why certain types of animals didn't survive, such as dinosaurs after the flood, is that if the base of their food chain is undergirded by these types of plants that do not survive and propagate well in the post-flood world, then that can help us see why the world is such a different place today than it was previously.
Okay, Dr. Galuza. My sister believed in creation until she went to medical school. Now she says she believes more in evolution because of how viruses change. How would you answer her?
Well, I would have to tell her, if I was sitting down and talking with her, I would not count her my enemy, and I would seek to win her back to the Lord Jesus Christ. And I presume that since she believed in creation, she had some nominal belief in the Lord Jesus. We could always debate whether she had a full belief or not, because whether you can leave or not. However, I would tell her that my experience in medical school was very, very different than hers. That as I sat in med school and I listened to lectures on anatomy and physiology, and I was taking notes feverishly, inside I was praising the Lord over and over again, because I was seeing things that were so complicated and yet so precisely designed and so well built for a specific purpose that as an engineer I knew humans couldn't even come close to designing anything like this. And I was learning about systems and physiology which made man-made systems look absolutely simple. So as I sat in med school, I was worshiping the Lord, praising the Lord, and hoping that I'd be able to share this with other people someday. And then I certainly learned about mechanisms, not just of viruses. It's viruses, bacteria, all kinds of creatures, human beings, are able to adjust. They're able to change. That's because organisms live on a dynamic planet that is constantly changing, and therefore any good designer would build those creatures, viruses included, with an ability to adjust. You would have to put that ability into them, otherwise they could never live on a dynamic planet. And so I would challenge her to look at the systems within any of the creatures, including viruses, and see if these systems are not innate to that creature, enabling that creature to adjust to all different kinds of conditions and take them on, including these plants. The plants that we were just talking about, plants that have abilities and capacities to live in all different types of environments, pre-flood and post-flood. And I'm not talking about just pure genetic power. I'm talking about dozens of different mechanisms, genetic mechanisms, epigenetic mechanisms, all of these which enable organisms to rapidly adjust to fit different situations. And I would challenge her to examine these systems, see if they don't dwarf any man-made systems, and see if, as it says there, she left creation, they wouldn't point back to a creator.
If I could just add too real quick, because this is a classic case of an equivocation fallacy, where the word evolution is being used in two different senses. Evolution can just mean change. Do things change? Of course they change. Nobody disagrees with that. But just because viruses can change doesn't mean that they become something that's not a virus. They don't change in a way that would be an evolutionary change, the kind of change that would make particles to people evolution happen. And that's one of the things why I try to really emphasize the logic and studying logic, because if she had known about that and recognized that not all changes turn particles into people, she might have recognized that's not evidence for evolution at all. That's change within a kind. What were they? Viruses. What are they now? Viruses. What were they? Viruses. That's not evolution. That's just viruses.
Amen.
Dr. Lyle, many presenters highlight examples that support their viewpoint and avoid the thorny ones that don't. What's the thorniest question you face, and how do you address it?
Distant starlight, and I did address it. So I'm very happy to bring up those kinds of issues. I think distant starlight's the one that people try to use, and they say, this proves the universe is billions of years old. And it's hard to answer, not because we don't have an answer, but because the answer involves understanding something about physics, and physics is hard. And so it's hard to give a soundbite answer to that question. I have to teach people a little bit about relativity, Einstein, physics, things like that. And so that makes it a tricky one to answer. So it'd be good in terms of scoring debate points to bring that up. But in terms of logic, I don't think they have anything. I honestly don't think there are any good reasons to reject the Christian worldview. And I would be honest with you if there were. I just haven't found any. I found ones that people will say, that on the surface it looks like this might be a problem, but then when you investigate it, it just never is. And so I would be very happy to bring up problems if there were any. I bring up the one that most people think is a problem, and I show you one way that we can answer that. But the Christian worldview, we're on solid ground, folks. I mean, we really are. It's a very defensible position, and what's more, any alternative to Christianity is not defensible. That's really what it comes down to. Any other thoughts?
Any other thorny questions you'd like to address, any of you?
Anybody else?
Well, I just want to kind of turn it around a little bit. We were all taught at secular schools, we were all taught the thorny questions, but they avoided teaching us the things that don't fit in their worldview. And as you do research, as you conduct research, particularly as you get to the graduate school level, you see all these problems that they never address. In geology, there's more problems that aren't explained than are explained, and I'm sure it's the same in all the sciences. But you don't really realize that until you get into that research level yourself, start doing graduate work. Then you realize all the things they didn't tell us, all the things they just gloss over at the undergraduate level, all the little white lies that they tell you don't worry about this, and why there's 8,000 feet of salt here, no, that's no problem. It's just the ocean evaporated a lot, and why there are 200-foot coal seams in Wyoming, well, we can't explain those either. And why we have all this dolomite in the early rocks, and there's no dolomite forming today hardly at all. There's all these little problems that they just get glossed over. And they might mention them, but they just ignore them.
Yeah, I think a thorny question this is actually one that goes up in Dr. Ross's field is, why don't you find why don't you find human bones in the lowest layers? Why don't you find earlier bones of creatures that we see in some of the earlier layers? And one evolutionist said, you know, as soon as I find some human bones down there with the dinosaurs, then I'll believe in creation. And what appears to be a thorny question is, why does it appear at first blush that the fossil record appears to show an evolution of life in it, and that you don't seem to find other creatures in different layers, but you just find certain ones in certain ones? That's kind of a thorny question to explain.
It is. And the resolution of the fossil record, and when you talk about things like Cretaceous and inside the Cretaceous, as I talked to the breakout session today, they got a hint of just how thorny this might be. You take the rock record that has the fossils, we call that the Phanerozoic, the visible life. And then you got the Paleozoic, that's your age of fish, the Mesozoic, that's your age of reptiles, and then your Cenozoic, that's your age of mammals. So dinosaurs are in the Mesozoic, age of reptile stuff. Now, this is really about what fossils are found in various layers with respect to other layers that have similar types of fossils in them. So when I was studying for my PhD, I studied mosasaurs, the big swimming marine lizards that you see in Jurassic World, for example. And if you haven't, see Jurassic World. So the mosasaurs are in the Cretaceous, along with some of the dinosaurs, but they're not